This is Judaism Unbound, episode 59, Jewish Futurology. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we're here today with Rabbi Hayim Herring, a Jewish futurist and organizational consultant. He is well known for having been the executive director for 8 years of STAR, Synagogue Transformation and Renewal, an organization that helped synagogues improve their work. They're most well known for the idea of the Synaplex, that's Synaplex, the idea that multiple things can be going on at once in the synagogue and not just the, quote, main service. We're really excited to have Hayim here with us today. He is the author, most recently, of Leading Congregations and Nonprofits in a Connected World, and recently also published a book that previous guest Barak Richmond and I were lucky enough to have a chapter in. The book is called Keeping Faith in Rabbis, a community conversation about rabbinical education. So we're really excited to talk with Hayim today about the Jewish present and future. Hayim, thanks so much for joining us on Judaism Unbound.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
So, in starting off, I think it would be interesting. We have not had yet on the show somebody whose professional resume actually bills them as a futurist. So I was hoping that we could start by understanding a little bit about what you mean by that and what you do as a Jewish futurist.
So a futurist is not someone who predicts the future. That would be foolhardy, as we all know, especially today. A futurist is someone who uses proven methodologies to bring groups of people together, to really use their collective wisdom to see further out beyond the horizon than any one individual can on their own.
So, I mean, just to give as a little bit of background and to understand sort of your professional evolution and sort of how you've come to this perspective that you now have in the Jewish community, you were a congregational rabbi for many years. And then you worked, at the Minneapolis Jewish Federation. And then you founded an organization called STAR, Synagogue Transformation and Renewal. And I'm curious about how that came about and how you moved from the world of I don't know what we would call it, sort of managing existing Jewish organizations to one of tell us about what your objective was back then and what you achieved and what you did.
Sure. And just slight correction, STAR had existed for a couple of years. I was its founding executive director and helped to move it and crystallize it. This is not a journey that I could have planned. I wish that I had known this process of looking further into the future, although life does have its unpredictable moments. So I have had really good experiences in each of my different iterations. But increasingly, I found that labels were constraining. They were very good at reinforcing what we knew we would never agree about, and very obstructionist when it came to at least trying to find consensus around what we could work on. And that was a long time ago already. Now, because everybody lives in a sort of cut and paste, do it yourself, try on multiple identity world, I think that my evolution was very serendipitous. I wanted to go back to school to get a PhD, and I thought the last thing that the world needed was another rabbi with a PhD in Talmud or Jewish education. However, by working in a congregation, by working in a federation, what I realized was people bring passion and heart, but also discipline, accountability, strategic foresight. These were things that were just not in the vocabulary. Training didn't really support that kind of outlook. By acquiring a PhD in organization and management, my hope was to be able to bridge the world of business and broader nonprofit world with Jewish organizational, synagogue and organizational world. Because when I started in congregations, as a congregational rabbi and at Federation and then at STAR, the dominant rule was still hierarchy. And I understand that as a rabbi, and I had a great education, but even though things have changed, when you go to school for 5 years and your model is generally all-knowing professor and not too much knowing student, and that's what you're inculcated with for 5 years, what do you reiterate when you get out into the world? Well, you're going to reiterate that model. Now, again, things have improved, but I think this idea of partnership, co-creation, and really developing a shared sense of ownership of vision and mission, that's a big revolution. And I think we've got more work to do on that.
I'm curious when we think about, so let's just stick for now in the world of synagogues and, let's say, adjacent activities, right? Some of these startup religious organizations, whatever we want to call them, if we want to call them synagogues or not. But it feels like there is an arc almost that I'm thinking as we're talking that you were very much involved with this sort of first step along the way, which was to say to existing synagogues, hey, you would be well served by having multiple things going on at the same time, not the old model of the synagogue has one service, but multiple services or perhaps even other things. And at STAR, you call that the Cineplex model. And then it sort of seems like one way you could be thinking about it is, well, that happened, but there were these other people who said, well, that's not good enough for us, right? And they went off and created these new startup kind of organizations. And from a certain perspective, if I were the rabbi of one of those congregations that said, hey, we're doing the Cineplex, I might feel kind of, well, wait a second, now we're doing all these new things, but it's still not good enough for these folks, and they're going off and creating something new. And now I'm thinking about those new organizations that have been hailed over the last 10 years. And on the one hand, like you say, their next step is to think about how to solidify themselves as organizations and whatnot. But my question is, well, but maybe there's now going to be another wave of folks saying, hey, but even that's not what I need, and going off and creating something more radical. And then 10 years later, there'll be that. And the question, in a way that I think about it, is how do we both respect whether it's the existing organizations or the first wave of innovation or whatever, and say, yes, all of those organizations have to kind of solidify. And at the same time, in their founding and in their success, they create sort of a plausibility structure that says to other people, hey, we can go even further and it's okay.
This is where we are in time right now. It is a challenge. It's exciting and exhilarating and a little anxiety producing if you're trying to run an organization. But at STAR, when I was there, we never looked at Cineplex as the end. It was a lever to see, could we instigate broader change? The programmatics, anybody can do programs. The problem is there are too many programs. The question is, can you build a different kind of infrastructure, which is what we started to do, and others have taken that to a different level, and I hope others will take it to the next level, where there's greater engagement, and that's the key. It's not relational, it's all about engagement. And this is how you answer the question of structure. Recognizing that we need lighter structures, that we need maximal autonomy and minimal structure. And I think it was Frank Barrett, who's an organizational specialist, who used that phrase, which I really love. We have to recognize that connecting people with their mission, holding that mission in front of them, connecting people with one another to feel the transcendent purpose, this power that you get by being with others in service of a mission, that should drive what the structure is going to look like and not the other way around. And that is not easy work, because it's natural to kind of latch on to what's working.
It's also economically challenging, right? Because your institution is kind of supported by a certain set of economic structures, whether that's membership or philanthropy that's coming from a certain kind of funder. And if the idea is that people should be more nimble and willing to change, obviously there's the psychological difficulties of that, but there's also the very practical difficulties of how do you take your funders along with you?
Daniel, you have touched the $64,000 question. It's really easy to tell someone leading an organization, a rabbi, a CEO, lay leaders, right? Be nimble. But how do you actually do that when you're trying to manage you're visioning for the future, and you have to pay the bills. So I think that there are a couple responses to that. One, that we're overbuilt and underutilized when it comes to real estate. And I think that opportunities for partnerships, collaboration, I know they're not easy. Figure out how to cut costs because we frankly don't need as much space as we have. Number two, I think that experimenting with different models, and that is risky. Can you find funders to help you during this phase of experimentation to make sure that at least a core part of your budget is being covered? So, for example, if I could mention one congregation, and that's or community, Labshul, that this year was experimenting with a kind of we-me model, a subscription model like a theater. I mean, what else is going to happen in New York when, you've got an artist-driven community? When they think about membership, right, what model will they come up with? On the other hand, some of the newer congregations are still going with membership dues but at a more voluntary rate, which is a misleading term because sometimes voluntary means we're going to tell you what the, quote, cost per family is, and you'll pay what you want. For others, it's really give what you can and build from a spirit of generosity. But at the same time, some of the established congregations are jettisoning the word member and membership because they don't want it to connote a relationship based on money. Millennials and the generation under, I don't know if it's been called the alpha generation or whatever it will be, their set of expectations with all institutions, with ideas of membership, are very different already. So on the one hand, that's more evidence that the membership model is just not going to work. But two other considerations that we have to talk openly about. A lot of things that synagogues and other Jewish organizations could uniquely provide at one time are available in the public domain. So we have to begin to think about what are the kind of core purposes, right? The core mission, and to reorganize around that mission, which means on the one hand, maybe cutting out certain things or developing collaborations with those who can do them better and still serve your, quote, members or constituents, but also going more deeply. And that's this whole question of engaging people more deeply. So that's one sort of balancing act that's going to have to happen. The other one is, I feel like there's something that feels to me that we've lost in the value of tzedakah, of giving generously, of giving charitable donations. And it could be my being a victim of nostalgia, but there was something about being a kind of a good citizen and contributing to a congregation or JCC or federation because that's what you did. We know that that sense of automatic loyalty is absent with younger generations. I think there's been a trickle-up effect with boomers and even those who are older. And part of the challenge that I see is the educational challenge in general that we have around tzedakah, around philanthropy, to make sure that it's not just a quid pro quo, but this sort of, as others have planted before me, to quote the famous story from the Talmud and Choni HaMe'agel, so too am I planting for those who will come after me. And I think we've got to work harder at that value.
But so let's pursue this a little more, because I'm actually thinking about this, and using my own experience as a lens, that when I think about the synagogue in my community, and I think about the extent to which I participate in it as a sort of member of the community versus my philanthropic support. And I think, I'm not a wealthy person, right? And so the synagogue dues, let's say, were about $2,500 a year. And I know in other places they're more, and in other places they're a little less. I don't give $2,500 a year to any charity. I can't afford it. So for me, a very generous philanthropic gift that's within what I can afford would be, $500, $1,000 maybe to the ones that I'm most committed to. So the idea that I would give a philanthropic gift of $2,500 to any organization is simply, outside of the realm of my experience. Now, where do I give amounts that size? To my children's school for tuition, right? And to other things that really are a service that I'm receiving, right? So for me, the challenge is less about the philanthropy, although I agree that that's also a challenge. We should make sure to cultivate a sense of philanthropy. But I fear that if we cultivate a sense of philanthropy, synagogues will be ending up with, at best, $500, $1,000 per person. And then the question is, how much service are you getting from the synagogue in addition to that philanthropy? And my guess is that for most people, it amounts to less than $1,500 worth. So on balance, they'll give less, even if their philanthropy was as well developed as we could possibly imagine. And that's why I'm concerned that the model is just irreparably broken and that somehow we're going to need something new.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I'm sorry to jump in before you could answer, Chaim, but I have a question that I think is related to what Dan's bringing up, because it's about sort of why I think many people aren't joining congregations. It relates to this question of purpose. I spend a lot of time in synagogue settings, not just synagogues, but often synagogues in the Jewish world, and they seem pretty frequently not to have a sense on a basic level of what their purpose is and what their mission is. And certainly they generally will talk about some general sense of building community, but there's not a sense that our congregation is X, which is in contrast to the other congregations in town or the other congregations you might have been a part of in the past. And we're going to be particularly good at that X factor. And maybe if you want Y, that's great, but we're not really the space for you. You should go to this synagogue down the street that complements some of what we do. There doesn't seem to be that kind of thinking. And I'd love to hear from you some thoughts on that, because everybody likes to talk about how millennials aren't joiners and, Gen Z or whatever we're calling the next generation isn't joiners. But I think we have high standards for what we join. And when there isn't a clear sense of what it is that we're joining, what the purpose is, that's when we don't. But when we find something that does have a strong sense of purpose, then it's often a pretty crowded spot.
Having just completed a book with my co-author and researcher, Terry Martinson Elton, Leading Congregations and Nonprofits in a Connected World, Platforms, People, and Purpose, we took a look at Lutheran congregations and established nonprofits and startups, and Jewish ones as well. Jews and Lutherans have a fair amount in common. They're Bible camps like we have camps, they're youth groups, they're established congregations with declining membership, and startups. So we found so many similarities that at times, I said we should call ourselves the Jutherans. There are a couple of changes in theology, but the presenting issues were the same. What we found consistently in established congregations and the more startup ones, as well as organizations, new ones and old ones, those that had a clear focus on mission and used it as a filter to say, we will do X, but we won't do Y, even at the risk of, alienating some people. Those are the congregations and organizations where when you walk in the door, there's like a pulsating kind of energy. And those are the congregations and organizations that attract people because they feel a sense of engagement with purpose. The challenge, congregations and organizations cannot afford to be, by and large, everything to everyone. And part of today's challenge is focus. What are the 3 to 5 things that we are passionate about, that we can do uniquely well? And there are success stories, both with the newer congregations, whether it's an Ikar or a Romamu or Lab Shul, as we mentioned, a congregation in St. Paul, Mount Zion Temple, which is, I think, founded in the late 1800s that has returned to mission, or whether it's a congregation, community synagogue of Rye, or an arts organization here in Minnesota called Ramon, the Minnesota Jewish Arts Council. These are organizations that are intensively focused on mission, and they are the ones that continue to be energetic and engage people across the generations.
I know that you think about this in both of its elements because you do consulting and you've also written about rabbinic leadership development. Actually, in a book that you edited, a book that I and Barak Richman, one of our earliest guests, wrote a chapter in about the training of rabbis. And I'm just thinking about, how we should even think bigger about these two things, like saying, okay, look, there are these organizations out in the Jewish world. The Jewish world in America is full of these organizations. They're in trouble of various kinds. Many of them are. One possibility is that they'll close, they'll merge, they'll do whatever, they'll do whatever they have to do. But if we can imagine a brighter future for them, then it seems that there's really only three pathways where that's going to happen. One is just somehow somebody in a leadership role there understands what to do, reads books, listens to podcasts, whatever they do, and lead and somehow has whatever it is to lead that change process. That feels to me like that's going to be extremely rare. Another kind is that they somehow engage some kind of helper, an organization, a consultant. I mean, back in the time when we were talking about synagogues changing, that was Star, and now, what is it? How can communities that say, hey, we really want to think differently, but we don't have the leadership that knows how to do it, what should they do? And then the third seems that our leadership education organizations, whether that's rabbinical schools or lay leadership education or whatever it might be, needs to be able to give our leaders, professional and lay, the way to think about this stuff and the skills to do something about it that really I don't think are a major part of the education of professionals or leadership now. So, is it the case that maybe the very, the place to push on the lever here is not synagogues or existing institutions at all, but actually is in the leadership education world? That's really where the most important work needs to be done, or what? How do you think? Or maybe consulting? We should figure out how to have more consultants in the world.
I think that what's concerning to me is rabbis, Jewish professionals in training who are going to school full time and working 20 to 30 hours a week. Not a good combination. What I would propose as an experiment on a limited scale, reduce the number of years of school, make it more intensive, provide greater scholarship for that reduced number, and then create more of the equivalent of teaching congregations, just like there are teaching hospitals, just like attorneys have to go. It's a little different, although that model's changing, I know, but during a summertime, or two to get some experience. So that's one piece that could really make a difference, but that means really changing the whole infrastructure of how we learn, because it means schools not just changing their curriculum, but having the right kind of sites that can serve to be mentoring, training grounds where people get on the ground faster, get paid sooner, maybe not as much, and really are mentored well. That assumes a certain number of mentors and training and a different kind of curriculum. That's number one. Number two, we haven't talked about, I don't like the term lay leadership because we don't have lay in ecclesiastical, but we haven't really talked about volunteer leadership. And this is an equation of volunteers, professionals and clergy, and schools. And if we can't bring these three parts of the conversation together, changing one only will make a difference, but it won't make enough of a difference. So where are the lay volunteer leaderships in this, right? What can they do to help leverage successful models of what congregational or organizational life can be.
You've talked a lot about mission. And so if you were in a situation where you had power over this, I mean, you do, what would your big ticket agenda items be? What needs to come first as we seek the paradigm shift that you describe?
Here's what I learned in the book, and here's what I'm seeing. The fragility of community. How the clergy and executive directors maintain a space where different voices can be heard and welcomed, and the same people with different ideas can still work collectively toward a common mission that they can agree upon. So holding together a diverse community is one of the palpable fears that we heard during the interviews with lay people, with volunteers, and with clergy. That's a big issue. Second issue, for the first time in human history, we have 4 generations of people alive in large numbers at one time. It's not like old age is new, but having so many elderly people and having young adults seem to take longer to reach maturity. So we don't have a sandwich generation anymore. It feels more like a hoagie generation, right? It's not vertical, it's horizontal. And how can congregations, Jewish organizations, right? Thinking of that hoagie metaphor. I don't want to lose the food piece because, we're Jewish after all, but how can we recognize that not only do we have a much extended period of time where we've got so many different people from different generations, where it doesn't just become an issue of feeling squeezed, but there can be mutually interactive shared learning. One more moment on this point. So, if I'm holding a smartphone and I fumble with an app and I've got a tween or a teen or an 8-year-old looking at me, I don't know anything to that person. But what they don't know is that they can't Google experience. So how do we connect that shared wisdom?
As we think of things that the Jewish world can provide that other communities will have a harder time providing, because that's what you alluded to, is there are many needs that it used to be only Jewish organizations could provide them for Jews, but now the whole world of possibilities is open to us. But one thing that I think is much easier to pull off in a Jewish organizational space is that transgenerational interaction. I in my daily life, literally I just don't see people who are more than, 30 years older than me on a regular basis. I live in an apartment in a neighborhood that's almost all other 20-somethings that are living in Providence, Rhode Island. And I just don't have that experience of learning from my elders or even teaching to those younger than me. It's mostly my own peer group. And that's how so many of our institutions secularly have been created, is that they're serving a particular age bracket. What Judaism can do that I think is a really great thing and really important is bridge that gap that you so beautifully just spoke about. So are there success stories of that, or are there congregations that when they've sort of done that digging deep, they've come to the conclusion that they really should focus in on that particular element of things? Because I haven't yet experienced that in a big way. I've mostly been in Jewish spaces that, they have the young adult Jewish group, they have the young families group, they have the baby boomer groups, they have et cetera. But that tradition of, passing between generations, that seems like something that's the domain of religion, or at least has historically been the domain of religion in a real way, that Judaism has too, and which could be spectacular if we committed to it.
I'm seeing a few models right now that are like wildly successful, but they're too few. And this is where I'd like to see maybe national organizations. You don't have to, send out a booklet on how to do it, but they could lift them up for other people to see, because those who are doing the work don't have enough time to sort of put out what it is that they're doing.
Here's where I kind of feel like, as aspirational as all of what you've talked about is, and I agree with it, I'm still puzzling over how to achieve it, because I feel like it's never been the case that people have gone to synagogue in order to have an intergenerational experience. They've gone to synagogue because they thought that they needed to go to synagogue for whatever set of reasons that we had. And by the way, they had an intergenerational experience, and that was very wonderful and very important. We don't want to lose that. But the problem that I'm struggling with is I just don't want to sit through 3 hours of praying to a God that I don't believe is listening in order to get that intergenerational experience. So, and I think that's true of a lot of Jews of all ages, right? Like, by the way, I want to be really clear that my understanding of the demographic shifts that we're seeing, all the Pew study, Jews of no religion business, it's just that there's a greater percentage of Jews that fall into these various categories, not affiliated, no religion, than there have been in previous generations. But in all previous generations, there were lots of Jews that fell into those categories too. And so I would love to have an intergenerational experience with the wise elder mentors that could speak to my beliefs and my experience. And those folks are not likely to be found in the synagogue. And so the question to me is, it's beyond Cineplex. It's like Jewishplex. How can we find multiple expressions of Judaism that would all be intergenerational and have all those other wonderful pieces, community building, mission-driven, social justice, whatever we want to say? How could we go about doing that?
We're locked into our own paradigms. Everything that you described, and let me reassure you, I don't pretend to speak for God, but I am most certain that God does not want you to sit through 3 hours of a service that you don't understand, praying to a God that you don't believe in order to get that multi-generational experience. So,
just to know, I do understand it, but I understand that many people also don't understand it.
Yeah, but again, you're thinking that implies you're thinking, oh, synagogue services. Well, we have to break that equation. What about synagogue platform for meaning and purpose within the mission? What
Right.
about a synagogue where, I'm going to, as the rabbi, clergy, cantor, educator, I'm going to open up a space and I'm going to put out an invitation for people who have experienced the civil rights movement, who are alive, to share their stories with those who are younger today. And I might frame it with a text or two, but that's going to be my opening space. And yeah, people didn't come for multi-generational reasons before, because not until too long ago, families were multi-generational within, if not the same house, within the same radius of the city. That's what we're losing. I don't want to underestimate how challenging it is, but it's a shift in terms of culture. It's a shift from thinking top down to grassroots, and they don't cost a lot, but they are very, very difficult to do. I'll give you one example, and I feel like incredibly blessed. So my rabbi, who is 92, I try to meet with him on a regular basis, just an amazing human being, said to me some time ago, and this is the model that we have. I don't know of a better one in Jewish community. So it's when you reach a certain age, you go to independent assisted living, to sort of nursing home, memory care unit, but usually it's on a campus. So what is the message that you're communicating? It's sort of like a trajectory downward, and people in the independent living feel like they've got something to give. Now, these campuses are very often far away or far enough away from the heart of the Jewish community. I don't know what a better model is. This is not easy, but I was having lunch with him one day, it's a few years ago already, and he said, people are respectful to me, they're very kind, but I'd really like to have some ongoing contact with them. That happened to be a month in which I had lunch with him, a 91-year-old, and someone who was young. They were only about 80. And I heard that refrain 3 times, and I thought, wow, we are really missing out on some potential, here's an opportunity.
It's funny, as I was sort of reflecting on what you said and just sort of thinking about the community building role of the synagogue, it struck me that, thinking about the transition of Judaism from Second Temple Judaism to Rabbinic Judaism and now to where we are, is that actually the transition from Second Temple Judaism to Rabbinic Judaism was one that created more community, right? Because in the Second Temple, you had your community and your family or whatever, but you would only go 3 times a year at best to make a pilgrimage, and that was much of the communal practice. Whereas with the move to Rabbinic Judaism, it was, every Shabbat you would go to the synagogue and you would have that community experience, or maybe even every day you would go to services. But the rest of your life you would live, in a different community or whatever. Now, this is striking me as one of the things that Lex and I have been talking about for a long time. Maybe one of the disjunctions with young people is, and even not so young people, that I feel like I almost live my life in community all the time through the internet, through Facebook, right? Through other types of experiences, that I'm constantly interacting with my community in a way that, Lex and I have talked about. And Lex has actually brought me along over the year to feel like this is increasingly meaningful to me. I really do feel like I'm part of this community all the time. So actually going to synagogue is less community feeling than I have all the time. So in a way, maybe part of the transition has to be to figure out a way to actually make the experience of collectivity, whenever that's going to be. Maybe it doesn't mean going once, maybe it's not once a week anymore. It's some way of making the Jewish experience even a more powerful experience of community. And part of the challenge comes from maybe some of the folks that are in those institutions not realizing and not fully honoring what level of community feeling we're already feeling from new technologies.
You have a great ability to just sort of press all my buttons, the two of you, at one time. So, first of all, a synagogue building is not a synagogue community. And I think that's where people get confused. So community, as you're saying, has to happen in the building, online, in people's homes, in the restaurant. Again, this is where platform to me becomes important, because platforms are just places for people to kind of gather who share certain things in common and maybe accomplish some good. And that can happen in multiple realms. But the technology danger is it's this paradox. You can connect with people all over. I love FaceTiming my grandson. Okay. I mean, it is like amazing because he doesn't live in Minneapolis. But at the same time, I know it's causing social isolation. So I think that this is one of these issues, again, where faith leaders and educators and volunteers like you can begin to raise the kinds of questions of calibrating the balance between online meeting and meeting in other kinds of digital spaces. And here, you've probably read many of her works. Someone, I don't know her, but she's certainly been influential, is Dr. Sherry Turkle, and highly recommend reading some of her works, who raises lots of questions. I think we've got to be the lab for experimenting. What does it mean to be raising people, young people, who walk with their heads down because they're looking at their devices instead of lifting their eyes up and just seeing somebody in front of them?
I hear you, and I certainly value what you're talking about. And at the same time, my experience of a very difficult election and post-election time has been that I have found my community through Facebook. I mean, yes, are there people in my local community that would also give me that feeling? For sure. I live in a quite homogeneous community from a political standpoint. So it's not like I'm not finding my community locally. And yet, I'm able to get that sense of community all the time, if I choose it, through Facebook and with people who, yes, I know personally, and this is not to discount the importance of personal interaction, but is to say that if we as a Jewish enterprise only say that technology is a isolating and is something that makes us not engage in the world as we should, then I worry that we're not speaking to the real experiences that people my age and certainly younger, Lex talks about this all the time, have of the world.
I understand whether or not I like it, and I generally do. Technology is here. And not only that, why should I define for somebody else what their community experience is like if they're getting it online, if they're getting it digitally? I'm actually not saying that, but what I am saying as somebody who feels a sense of responsibility for future generations as well, because, that's kind of what we do when we reach a certain age. I want to learn from those who are younger how they're finding and experiencing community. And I also want to be able to share with them the empathy, the accountability, learning how to read people socially, that right now at least, we can't get or can only get in a limited way, especially the accountability piece online. When there's hologram technology at our desktop, or in our palm, will that make a difference? It might. But at least for the interim, it's really trying to find that balance to hear how people of different generations are experiencing community and what the positives and the negatives are in each sort of platform space.
As a rabbi, as somebody who, thinks a lot about the content of Judaism, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this sort of transitional period and what elements of Judaism, perhaps ones that were not as emphasized in the past, could become more important as we move into the future. And are there things that you see that really have less resonance and probably ought to fade into the background and, you have experienced that people aren't allowing them to fade into the background because of nostalgia or whatever? And I'm just curious to spend a little bit of time talking about the substance of Judaism and not just the process of change.
I think that if we don't have prophets today, we have artists. And it may be an unfair burden to put on them. But very often, and I'm speaking experientially and I'm speaking professionally, I find very often that within the arts community, when arts are brought into contact with Jewish tradition, there's a sort of freshness and openness for a number of reasons. One, while arts are in some ways solitary, art making is solitary, presentation is collaborative. And I think that that's really valuable. I love text. It's foundational to my core, and I think to the core of the Jewish people. When you bring text into interaction with performance, music, dance, not as an add-on, not to make a service a little bit more peppy, but really that's a starting point. Now, using that starting point, how do these experiences, rituals, stories look and feel different? I like that because arts can be a bridge builder, right? You don't have to be secular or religious or Jewish or not Jewish. And I'd like to see more work around that area.
So just in closing, are there any things that we haven't talked about yet that you really want to have a chance to talk about and to say?
That's always an opening invitation for danger to a rabbi. I'm just going to say thank you to both of you, not only for today, but for the work that you're doing and for the kind of thought partnership that you provide for people like me. Thank you so much, and thank you to your listeners.
Well, thank you, Hayim Herring, for joining us for this episode. It was really a great conversation, and I feel like we've got some great insights moving forward to play with. So On that note, we want to close out this episode in the way that we always do, which is by encouraging you out there, the listeners, to be in touch with us. And there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you could always check out our website, judaismunbound.com. And we've got our email addresses, dan@nextjewishfuture.org and lex@nextjewishfuture.org. Last but not least, we always want to encourage folks to support us financially if you are able. And the way for you to do that is to head to judaismunbound.com/donate, where you can make either a monthly donation that recurs or a one-time gift. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.